Greetings, ogres and optimizers. This video explores the iceberg of Symbaroum's rules by looking at the variants presented in the Core Rulebook and the Advanced Player's Guide. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming you've already seen one of the combat rules videos for the basics. I'll be reviewing each rule and giving it a sort of grade based on if I'll be using it, giving it a green light if I think it's good, a yellow light if I would be hesitant to use it at my table, and a red light if I don't think it adds anything worthwhile to my game. Even more so than my other Symbaroum grading videos, this is an extremely subjective take based on my preferences and the people I usually play with. Some of my red lights may be green lights for you, and that's just fine. I'm not here to yuck your yum. Overall, I think it's great that the design team gave us so many options to customize the game to our preferences on top of the already great base game. And just to set expectations, I do love the base rules of Symbaroum and tend to run a pretty raw or rules as written game. So don't expect a ton of green lights. Now, get comfy and grab some Zarekian Black Brew because I have 35 of these rules to talk about. Most of them have a lot of text, which I won't be reading, but I'll put it on screen for you to pause on if you're interested. Let's roll. Our first rule is instant kills. When an attack that brings a character to 0 toughness also breaks their pain threshold, the attack kills the target straight away. I don't mind this because it isn't going to happen frequently, but when it does happen, it will be impactful. I'm not giving it the green light just because I think Symbaroum is already a pretty hardcore system, and while I like danger for our player characters, I'm also not a sadist. Up next is modifications for critical damage. When a character takes damage that exceeds their pain threshold, they have a second chance to fail all tests for the remainder of the scene. For me, this is a bit much. Getting hit for your pain threshold is already hard enough to recover from, so I don't think you need this extra injury mechanic on top of it. I will say that it is a simple and effective means to make those big hits have a lasting impact if that's what you're into. Monstrous traits for player characters is a neat feature that is ultimately better codified within certain boons and burdens in the Advanced Player's Guide. If you're playing without the Advanced Guide, this is an okay pickup for your table. Now we have the option to play as an abomination when you take maximum corruption. So, this is neat. Normally, when you become totally corrupted, you lose control of your character, but this rule allows the player to play on as their abomination. I'll admit this is enticing, but ultimately, I'm not with it. I like the finality and the tragedy of the player losing control more than the PvP hijinks that can occur after with this rule. Let's talk about rerolls for experience, our first mechanic that uses experience points as an in the moment resource rather than something you use to level up with later. And I have to say I have a lot of bias against this. I've never been a fan of old school D&D rules for spending XP to make scrolls, for example. I've had GMs use rules like this in Pathfinder and even in LARP. So when I say I'm not for it in Symbaroum, I recognize that it's because of those other games. I actually think that Symbaroum does this better than all of those other examples and keeps the rules short and sweet, but I still think it has more potential to lead to slow turns and feels bad moments more than it has potential for one epic roll right when you need it. XP in Symbaroum is precious and slowly drip fed to players, so spending a full point on a random chance and setting yourself back an ability hurts, and it hurts even worse when you reroll and fail anyway. And I'm also not a huge fan of rerolling for permanent corruption. This is a very finite resource on your character sheet. More finite if you are a mystic, although this does add something interesting if you are a non-mystic martial character. All in all, I just don't think it is worth a single reroll that again can fail to have this permanent mark on your sheet. Up next is perfect hits and fumbled defense. Do you like crits? Here's your crits. Nat 1s provide plus 1d6 or 3 damage. Nat 20s provoke a free attack. Pretty fair, honestly. I've become a jaded grognard with crits in D&D. Sure, critical hits are fun, but the nat 1 means you have a 5% chance of your competent fantasy hero stumbling and vomiting and shitting themselves every time they swing their sword. Maybe the compromise is to provide the rush of landing a critical hit while eliminating the chance of critical failure. This one's not for me, but I think it's fairly harmless. If my players want it, I'll allow it. And now we have an interesting rule with life goals. I already adore the goals system in Symbaroum, so adding broader ideals in the form of life goals should be great, right? Well, I think that the dangerous combat and short term goals of Symbaroum actually lends itself towards shorter adventures, so adding on a defining life mission for your character kind of goes against that vibe. That said, it's clear that this was a passion project for one of the writers, and they did a great job with this expanded section. If you are playing in a long term game or even a short term game exploring deeper themes and want to develop those life goals as you go along, this provides a wonderful guide for that. Just be careful not to spend a week developing your life goal for the character I'll be one shotting with a troll in their first session. We move on to movement by scale. 5 foot squares, regular movement is 5 squares per turn. I really like the easier flow of combat created by Symbaroum's simple movement rules, and this slows things down drastically. I feel like this was an obligatory inclusion that works for some tables, but I will be avoiding it and moving on. The attribute array in Symbaroum is typically pretty static and simple, but this provides an opportunity to roll for your attribute values. You roll 2d6 plus 3 8 times to get your attributes. I am actually completely against rolling stats for your character in a long term game for a number of reasons. I only like it for something on the sillier side, like a pulpy dungeon crawl classics funnel. If you want randomly generated characters for a one shot, this is fun. Otherwise, I strongly recommend avoiding this. So now we have a weird little idea with specific experience. You only spend experience on abilities that were used in the adventure or new ones. So if you don't use an ability, you can't level it up. This is an interesting perspective that does make sense ludonarratively, but I don't think it's really worth keeping track of whether or not you checked all your boxes on an adventure. I don't hate this, but I'm still not going to use it. And now we have the use of persuasive roles between player characters. This really comes down to everyone's personal preference on how they want to play their character in interactions, and that's how I've come to play it at my tables. It's less a table rule and more of an individual choice. If a player wants to make a roll against another player and that other player is fine with it, then cool. Otherwise, no dice. And those are all the original optional rules presented in the core rulebook. When we get into the advanced player's guide, things get weirder. It includes optional rules, but also some tacked on wacky features and a few rules that would have been in the core rulebook but didn't make the cut. While I appreciate the designers letting us peek behind the curtain, just like deleted scenes in a movie, I can see why some of these were cut from the original product. Let's see what we got. The Advanced Player's Guide adds in a lot of alchemical weapons that can be used by any character, though with some consequence. This rule establishes that not just anyone can pick up a firearm and use it. And I think this is good. The use of guns and bombs in your fantasy game is already going to be contentious at many tables, so I think if a player wants to incorporate mines, grenades, and the good old alchemical fire tube into their fantasy, they can invest into it with an ability. The sidebar on mishaps is a nice compromise if you want everyone to be able to pick up an alchemical weapon but at a risk. This is a good rule that complements the Advanced Player's Guide's alchemical additions quite nicely. We have an optional rule for distance categories, and I already covered my thoughts on distance, and while I appreciate the compromise between totally abstract movement in the classic rules and counting Monopoly squares like in the core rulebook optional rule, this is still not my thing. And now we have an option that when your character dies, they don't die, but they become undead. This is interesting. Including this option in your game says a lot about your take on the world and the magic of Symbaroum, and you could make this conditional based on how a character dies or even where they die. I'm more compelled by a player becoming undead than controlling an abomination because of the extra work done in the Advanced Player's Guide on undead characters, but I would still be very cautious with using this as it could lead to a drastic lowering of the stakes at your table. or a raising of the stakes for peasants who find your characters. That was a vampire joke. And naturally, we have the option for turning undead instead of an abomination when you become thoroughly corrupted, and I'm also more lenient on this option. We now come to feats, which is not like a D&D feat that's already kind of like the abilities in Symbaroum. These are more like deeds or stunts in other games. They include options like a clean hit, fearless, ignore corruption, perfect defense, quick strike, resilience, steely gaze, and whirlwind attack. All cost 1 experience point or 1 permanent corruption, which we already saw with the reroll options in the core rulebook. Well, this involves spending experience, so I'm already sour on it, and while I think the option for permanent corruption provides some cool crossplay between the game's mechanics, I still think it's too harsh a price to pay for one little trick. My main issue with this is that it slows down play. Symbaroum turns are typically pretty snappy, but now anytime you roll, you want to glance down at these 8 options that complicate things, although they can have great payoff. More than some other red light options, I can see some folks really being drawn to this one, but I'm not a fan. We get to Symbaroum's take on encumbrance, and I'm actually just not giving this one a light. It's perfectly fine, it gets the job done, and it has its place in a more wilderness survival heavy adventure, but I'm always bored with this kind of feature, and me and my players wind up ditching it or just forgetting about it. Research in archives makes total sense and should just be a base rule that doesn't have to specifically apply to archives, but any kind of knowledge role. It's just good to the point that I'm not sure why it was included. Quite similarly, we have an alternate rule for starting with free experience rather than the typical model, but I think most GMs were already doing this. Telling your players start with 50 experience is so much easier than saying start with 5 novice abilities or 2 novice abilities and 1 adept ability, please. It also becomes more necessary if you're playing with boons and burdens, which I recommend everyone does, so this one absolutely gets a green light. We have an alternate rule for more rituals with masters where after reaching the maximum of rituals, typically you can spend more experience for more rituals. I want to like this rule, but the more I think about it, the more I can't really justify it. I know that saying 6 rituals maximum is going to feel like an arbitrary cap for your character, but rituals are often the most complicated parts of your character sheet, and having a lot of them will quickly make for an overtuned mess of a character, so I think it's necessary to put some kind of limit on that. The flight and hunt rules are good. You were probably already doing something like this in your game, and this just codifies it nicely. Easy green light. Similarly, I think most game masters already included traps in their ruins without having to be told to, and this rule gives players and GMs more control in a manner that's exactly as complicated as it needs to be, while allowing for a lot of creative freedom for coming up with more diabolical traps. Traps are fun! This gets a green light. We have trading in used goods and treasure. This is a good rule you were probably already using anyway without realizing it. Income from boons makes perfect sense too. If these green light picks are going by fast, I'm sorry I don't have much to say about the rules that are just solidly good with easy implementation and 0 drawbacks. So now it's time to slow things down and talk about maneuvers. We've got careful aiming charge, delay initiative, disarm, full defense, full offense, hold, knockout, poison on weapons, pushback, tackle, and take the initiative. Oh boy. I really like Symbaroum's simple but hard-hitting combat. Some people like a little more complexity, and I can see the argument of wanting to describe your character's actions a little more cinematically, as well as provide more narrative oomph than I swing my sword. But this is a big yellow light for me. I am intrigued by these options, but I am wary of opening Pandora's box and having every combat turn be a calculation of all these choices rather than a simple menu of stuff that works. I considered going point by point through each of these options, but my opinion on them is basically the same. These are very well thought out implementations of these ideas if you are okay with using those ideas in the first place. I will leave them on screen so you can pause and read and see if they are right for your table, but I am going to continue the video. The monster trophies rule is so good, I wish it was the standard to such a degree that every monster stat block should just include one or two trophies and their values. Everyone loves loot, especially when that loot is specifically related to the thing they just fought hard to kill. The examples provided scratch the surface but provide open opportunities for more examples from you as the game master. But my favorite use of this kind of rule is just to turn it around on the player and ask them, what do you find on the troll's corpse? Mastercrafted items are great. Moving on. Pact making is intriguing but risky, an easy yellow light. The broader section provides more context but also leaves me wanting more, which I think is actually more credit to the design team. I've had a lot of D&D campaigns go awry from selfish warlocks or even dungeon masters playing up their patron too much. And the idea that that sort of development happening from a standard encounter rather than a conscious choice at character creation could be a very cool story beat, but it could also be a trap, especially if you use it too often. I think this is best approached as a group choice to parley with the entity rather than kill it. And it also gives game masters a backup option to avoid a TPK or a villain being killed too early. Proceed with caution. Damage with buildings makes sense, but I just don't like tracking the HP of stone walls and wooden barrels, especially damage over time like the detailed description on fire. Sometimes this can add a fun objective in a combat encounter, but as a standard rule for every session, it's not something I want to include. We come to Symbaroum's take on reclaiming bolts and arrows after the combat scene is over, and this one is fine. If you've played any role playing game, you probably already have an opinion on this one without having to read it. I tend to not like tracking any ammo in any game, but for some reason, the vibe hits better in the world of Symbaroum, and my eyes aren't glazing over when I read this section quite like with the encumbrance section. The Secrets of the Traditions rule provides limitations on what your crafters can create. The Secrets of the Tradition rule is convoluted and unnecessary, but I actually like it quite a bit because it helps make the magic something that exists within the story rather than something that exists outside the game as simply a mechanic. There should be a separation of what powers can be used by a particular crafter, even though I am also open to you telling me why your crafter can make this one thing outside of their tradition because of their backstory. If it deepens the lore and the narrative without taking too much time away from what matters, I'm for it. Secrets of the Traditions gets a green light. And now there is a surprisingly thorough section on hit locations. I don't like hit locations. The rules here are fine, and it's a miracle that they got everything on one page, even though you can tell the designers started telling all the different implications this has. I like the extra impact that rolling on a table like this could have for a critical hit or something, but I don't like turning every attack into pulling out your VAT scanner. The reputation system, for me, is much ado about nothing, and that's coming from somebody who loves the political intrigue and faction rivalries within Symbaroum. I can calculate just fine whether or not you're in good graces with Queen Corinthia by jotting down a little heart next to your name. I don't need more numbers to complicate things. No thank you. And finally, the overlapping effects rule seems like a sensible inclusion. And we are done. If I sound just a little frustrated after reading all of that in one sitting, it's because I am. So I want to touch on the ultimate problem I have with these rules, and that is in their combination. You might enjoy having hit locations or maneuvers or feats for your characters, and that's fine. But when you have hit locations and maneuvers and feats, and you always have the option to reroll with your experience or with a point of permanent corruption, at some point you have to get a view of the big picture and ask if you're really having fun with your role-playing game. Maybe you are. I'm not going to tell you that you're not actually having fun if you know you are having fun. But having every option available at all times is not fun for me, and it bogs down my games and turns them into less of a story and more of an accounting exercise. And that is going to wrap up this video. I hope this was informative and you can form your own opinion on which rules are right for your game. You can even make a little Session Zero minigame of it to use the same red light, green light system with your players to see what options intrigue them. But if I have one recommendation, maybe don't use all 35. Part of what got me hooked on Symbaroum was the simplicity compared to the crunch of games like Pathfinder or even 5e D&D. I appreciate that the designers offered these options for everyone to modify their game to their liking, but I have the most respect for the initial product they presented. Have a nat one day. Bye bye.